Hi there. I'm Margaret Thompson, and I'm 32 years old. Last month, I stood in my childhood home watching my father humiliate me in front of 50 family members at his anniversary party. For years, he'd stolen credit for my work while telling me I'd never succeed. But that night, when he said those crushing words again, something inside me finally snapped. I decided it was time to expose the truth about what he'd really been doing behind my back all these years. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you won't believe what happened when I finally found my voice and fought back. Growing up in suburban Detroit, I was the middle child sandwiched between my two brothers in a working-class family that valued traditional roles above everything else. My father, Frank, worked long hours as a factory supervisor at the local automotive plant, while my mother, Helen, kept busy as a secretary at the neighborhood elementary school. Our three-bedroom ranch house sat on Maple Street, where every lawn looked identical, and dreams were expected to stay within reasonable boundaries. From the earliest age, I showed an unusual fascination with technology that baffled my entire family. While other 8-year-old girls played with dolls or jump rope, I spent countless afternoons in our basement workshop carefully dismantling discarded electronics that neighbors threw away. I'd spread the components across newspaper on my father's workbench, studying circuit boards and trying to understand how each tiny piece contributed to the whole machine. The day I successfully built my first working computer from those salvaged parts remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. I'd spent 3 months learning about processors and memory chips, reading library books about programming languages, and slowly assembling my creation. When that monitor finally flickered to life, displaying the simple text I'd programmed, I felt like I'd discovered fire. I raced upstairs to find my father breathless with excitement, eager to share my breakthrough moment. Dad, you have to see what I built downstairs. It actually works." Frank barely looked up from his evening newspaper, his beer cans sweating rings onto the coffee table. "Margaret, stop wasting time with that junk. Girls don't need to know about computers. Focus on something useful like cooking or cleaning." My enthusiasm deflated like a punctured balloon. "But Dad, I taught myself how to program it. Look what it can do." "That's enough," he said, snapping his paper with irritation. "Those machines are a fad. Real work happens with your hands, not playing around with expensive toys. Now go help your mother with dinner." Throughout high school, this pattern repeated itself with devastating consistency. Every achievement I earned in mathematics and science courses was dismissed as luck, or attributed to having good teachers. When I spent my junior year developing a complex software program for the regional science fair, Frank showed zero interest in attending the presentation. The night before the competition, I practiced my speech in front of my bedroom mirror, explaining how my inventory tracking system could revolutionize small business operations. My program could predict stock shortages, optimize ordering schedules, and reduce waste by analyzing purchasing patterns. For a 17-year-old working with limited resources, it represented months of intensive research and coding. The science fair judges were thoroughly impressed. My project earned first place in the computer science category and qualified for the state-level competition. The local newspaper even ran a small article about my achievement, complete with a photograph of me standing proudly beside my display board. Frank missed the entire event because he'd volunteered for overtime at the plant. When I arrived home that evening, clutching my blue ribbon and newspaper clipping, he was already asleep on the couch. My mother, Helen, quietly congratulated me, but suggested I shouldn't wake him since he'd had a particularly exhausting day. College application season brought our philosophical differences into sharp focus. My guidance counselor strongly encouraged me to apply to prestigious engineering programs, specifically mentioning MIT and Stanford as excellent matches for my academic profile. My SAT scores placed me in the 99th percentile, and my grade point average ranked third in our graduating class. When I excitedly showed Frank the MIT application materials, his reaction was swift and decisive. "Absolutely not. We're not spending that kind of money on fancy schools for a girl who'll just get married and quit working anyway. Community college offers perfectly good secretarial programs right here in town. But Dad, I could get scholarships. My grades are good enough, and my science fair project really impressed the judges. I want to study computer engineering. Frank's laugh held no warmth. Computer engineering. Margaret, be realistic. Girls don't become engineers. You'll end up teaching elementary school or working as a nurse. Pick something practical and stop dreaming about things that won't happen. The most painful part wasn't just his dismissal of my abilities, but watching him enthusiastically support my brother's ambitions. When my older brother announced his intention to study business administration, Frank immediately began researching the best programs and discussing payment options. My younger brother received similar encouragement for his interest in automotive repair with Frank, promising to help him start his own garage someday. I applied to MIT anyway, completing the lengthy application process entirely on my own. Working 20 hours per week at the local grocery store, I saved every penny toward application fees and potential tuition costs. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, accompanied by a partial scholarship offer that would cover 60% of my expenses. Frank's response to this remarkable achievement was characteristically disappointing. I hope you're not seriously considering this foolishness. Even with that scholarship, you'd graduate with massive debt for a degree you'll never use. Women don't belong in engineering programs. That conversation marked the beginning of my financial independence. If Frank wouldn't support my education, I'd find alternative methods to fund it myself. I increased my grocery store hours, took on tutoring jobs for struggling classmates, and applied for every available scholarship and grant program. By graduation, I'd secured enough financial aid to make MIT affordable, though it would require continued part-time employment throughout college. The night before leaving for Massachusetts, Frank made one final attempt to change my mind. It's not too late to enroll at the community college here. You could live at home, save money, and study something sensible. This MIT experiment is going to end badly, and I don't want to hear any complaints when it does. I packed my belongings into 2 battered suitcases, including the newspaper clipping from my science fair victory and the blue ribbon I'd earned. Those small tokens represented proof that my dreams had value, even if my own father couldn't recognize their significance. MIT's campus intimidated me initially with its imposing brick buildings and incredibly brilliant student body, drawn from around the world. My dormitory room was tiny, barely large enough for a desk and narrow bed, but it represented something invaluable, a space where my ambitions were welcomed rather than dismissed. The computer science program demanded every ounce of my intellectual capacity. I spent countless nights in the lab, debugging code and collaborating with classmates who shared my passion for technology. For the first time in my life, being intelligent and ambitious wasn't treated as unusual or inappropriate. My part-time job at the campus bookstore helped cover living expenses while I maintained a demanding course load. Most weekends found me either working register shifts or hunched over programming assignments, but I'd never felt happier or more purposeful. During junior year, inspiration struck while I was struggling with a particularly challenging algorithms course. Professor Williams had assigned a project requiring students to design a system for optimizing complex scheduling problems. As I researched existing solutions, I realized that most inventory management systems used incredibly inefficient methods for predicting demand patterns. I began developing a revolutionary algorithm that could analyze purchasing history's seasonal trends and external economic factors to predict inventory needs with unprecedented accuracy. My system could reduce warehouse waste by 30% while ensuring popular items never went out of stock. The mathematical elegance of the solution excited me more than anything I'd ever created. Working 18-hour days for 3 months, I refined the algorithm until it performed flawlessly across multiple test scenarios. My professor was so impressed that he encouraged me to present the project at the regional undergraduate research conference. The positive feedback from industry professionals who attended the presentation filled me with incredible pride. Eager to share this success with my family, I called home on a Sunday evening when I knew everyone would be gathered around the kitchen table. Dad, I have amazing news. I've developed this incredible software that could revolutionize how businesses manage their inventory. My professor thinks it has real commercial potential. Frank's voice carried its familiar tone of skepticism. Margaret, stop getting carried away with yourself. Every college student thinks their homework assignments are earth-shattering discoveries. Focus on passing your classes and getting a job when you graduate. But Dad, this is different. Industry experts who saw my presentation said it could save companies millions of dollars. I might even be able to patent the algorithm and start my own business. Listen to me carefully, Frank said, his voice hardening. You're a student, not an inventor. These grandiose ideas will only distract you from real responsibilities. Stop dreaming and focus on getting a practical job that pays steady wages. His dismissal stung deeply, but I'd grown accustomed to his lack of faith in my abilities. What I didn't expect was the phone call I received from my mother 6 months later, delivered with uncharacteristic nervousness in her voice. Margaret, honey, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to get upset with your father. What's wrong, Mom? Well, you know how you told us about that computer program you developed for inventory management. Your father mentioned it to his friend Bill, who owns that small manufacturing company downtown. Bill was having problems with his warehouse system, and your father suggested that your idea might help. My stomach dropped. What exactly did Dad tell Bill? Helen's pause lasted too long. He explained your program to Bill, and they decided to implement something similar in his warehouse. It's been working really well, and Bill is very grateful for the suggestion. Mom, did Dad tell Bill that the idea came from me? Another pause. Well, not exactly. Bill thinks your father came up with the solution himself. Your father said he didn't want to complicate things by bringing up college projects and such. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My father had stolen my innovative algorithm, presented it as his own idea, and was now receiving credit for my months of intensive work. When I confronted him during my next phone call home, his response was characteristically dismissive. Margaret, you're overreacting. Bill needed help, and I happened to remember something you'd mentioned about computers and inventory. I simplified your complicated academic theory into something actually useful. If anything, I improved on your original idea. Dad, that algorithm represents months of research and development. It's my intellectual property, and you had no right to share it without my permission. Intellectual property? Frank laughed. You're a college student doing homework assignments. Real business solutions come from practical experience, not textbook theories. Bill and I adapted your basic concept into something that actually works in the real world. The conversation ended with Frank hanging up on me, leaving me staring at my dormitory phone in complete disbelief. My own father had stolen my work, claimed credit for my innovation, and then dismissed my rightful anger as childish overreaction. This incident marked a turning point in our relationship. I realized that Frank didn't just doubt my abilities. He actively worked to undermine my achievements while positioning himself as the source of any success I managed to earn. The pattern would only grow more pronounced as my career developed. Graduation from MIT brought a mixture of tremendous pride and lingering family tension. I'd completed my computer engineering degree summa cum laude, earned recognition for my senior thesis on machine learning applications, and secured a position with a promising tech startup in San Francisco called Innovate Tech Solutions. The graduation ceremony itself perfectly illustrated my family's complicated dynamics. Helen beamed with pride as I walked across the stage, taking numerous photographs and dabbing at her eyes with tissues. My brothers seemed genuinely impressed by the prestigious setting and the caliber of my fellow graduates. Frank, however, spent most of the day complaining about the pretentious ceremony and questioning why the university needed such an elaborate campus. All these fancy buildings and expensive decorations, he muttered during the reception. No wonder tuition costs so much. They should focus on practical education instead of showing off. When relatives back home asked about my achievement, Frank's descriptions varied dramatically depending on his audience. To his coworkers at the plant, he described my degree as some computer thing that probably won't lead anywhere stable. But when speaking to neighbors or casual acquaintances, his tone shifted completely. "Oh yes, my daughter Margaret graduated from one of those expensive schools back east," he'd say, with barely concealed pride. "I always knew she had potential. We made sure she got a good technical education." Moving to San Francisco represented my first taste of true independence. My studio apartment in the Mission District was tiny and expensive, but it belonged entirely to me. Innovate Tech Solutions occupied a converted warehouse in the South of Market area, where 30 ambitious programmers worked on cutting-edge applications for emerging internet technologies. My first project involved developing user interface improvements for email software, which might sound mundane today, but represented groundbreaking work in the mid-1990s. The team environment energized me tremendously. My colleagues valued creative problem-solving and innovative thinking, creating a workplace culture completely opposite from my father's factory mentality. Within 6 months, I'd earned recognition for streamlining the code architecture and reducing program loading times by 40%. My supervisor, Janet Richardson, praised my intuitive understanding of user behavior and suggested I take on more complex projects. The breakthrough that established my reputation came during my second year with the company. I noticed that our customer service department was overwhelmed with user complaints about software crashes and data loss. After analyzing the error reports, I identified patterns that suggested memory allocation problems in our core programming. Working evenings and weekends, I developed a comprehensive diagnostic tool that could predict and prevent these crashes before they occurred. The solution required completely rewriting sections of our foundational code, but the results were dramatic. Customer complaints dropped by 80%, and several major clients specifically praised our software's new stability. Industry publications began mentioning Innovate Tech's innovative approach to error prevention, and my diagnostic tool became a selling point for new client acquisitions. Janet recommended me for promotion to senior developer, which came with a substantial salary increase and stock options in the company. When I called home to share this exciting news, the family's reactions followed predictable patterns. Helen expressed genuine enthusiasm and asked thoughtful questions about my new responsibilities. My brothers congratulated me and seemed impressed by my rapid career advancement. Frank's response was more complex and contradictory. During our phone conversation, he minimized the significance of my promotion, suggesting that all these tech companies hand out fancy titles to make employees feel important. He questioned whether stock options had any real value and warned me not to count on paper profits that might disappear overnight. However, his tune changed completely when describing my success to others. I learned from Helen that Frank had been telling neighbors about my daughter who works for a big computer company in California, and how he always encouraged her interest in technology. He'd apparently purchased copies of the trade magazines that mentioned our company, though he never mentioned reading about my contributions when we spoke directly. This pattern of private dismissal and public credit claiming became increasingly pronounced as my career progressed. Frank seemed unable to acknowledge my achievements to my face, but he had no hesitation about basking in reflected glory when speaking to his social circle. The most frustrating aspect was his gradual rewriting of our family history. In Frank's revised version of events, he'd been a supportive father who recognized my technical aptitude early and encouraged my pursuit of higher education. He conveniently forgot his opposition to my MIT application and his predictions that I'd fail in a technical career. "I always told Margaret that computers were going to be important," he'd say to relatives during holiday gatherings. "I made sure she learned about technology from an early age. All that time she spent in the basement workshop was part of my plan to prepare her for this kind of career." These statements were so contrary to my actual childhood experiences that I initially thought Helen had misunderstood his conversations. But multiple family members confirmed hearing similar claims from Frank, delivered with complete conviction and apparent sincerity. My attempts to correct these false narratives were usually dismissed or ignored. When I reminded Frank that he'd actively discouraged my interest in computers, he'd claimed that I'd misinterpreted his practical concerns, or that he'd been testing my determination to make sure I was serious about the field. By age 29, I felt ready to take the entrepreneurial leap I'd been planning for years. My experience at Innovate Tech had taught me valuable lessons about software development, client relations, and business operations. More importantly, I'd identified a significant gap in the market for specialized database management solutions for small and medium-sized businesses. Most existing software options were either too expensive for smaller companies or too simplistic for growing organizations with complex needs. I envisioned creating customizable database systems that could scale efficiently while remaining affordable and user-friendly. Leaving the security of my senior developer position required tremendous courage, but I'd saved enough money to support myself for 18 months while building my new company. My studio apartment became corporate headquarters with my kitchen table serving as conference room and my bedroom closet functioning as supply storage. When I called home to announce my decision to start my own business, Frank's reaction was swift and characteristically negative. "Margaret, you're making a huge mistake. You have a perfectly good job with steady pay and benefits. Why would you throw that away to chase some fantasy about being a business owner?" "Dad, I've been planning this for years. I have a solid business plan, enough savings to get started, and clients already interested in my services. This isn't a fantasy. It's a calculated risk based on real market research." "Listen to me," Frank said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd learned to dread. 90% of new businesses fail within the first year. You're a smart girl, but you don't understand how complicated running a company really is. Stick with your engineering job and leave business ownership to people who know what they're doing. Despite his pessimistic predictions, I incorporated Thomson Database Solutions in January and immediately began working with my first 3 clients. The initial projects involved converting outdated paper filing systems into digital databases, which required both technical programming skills and patient training for employees who'd never used computers professionally. My background in user interface design proved invaluable for creating systems that were powerful enough for complex operations, yet intuitive enough for daily use by non-technical staff. Word-of-mouth referrals began generating new client inquiries within 3 months, validating my belief that a market existed for this specialized service. The company's first major breakthrough came when a regional restaurant chain hired me to develop a comprehensive inventory and scheduling system for their 12 locations. The project required 6 months of intensive development, but the results were spectacular. My system reduced food waste by 25%, optimized staff scheduling to minimize labor costs, and provided real-time reporting that helped managers make better operational decisions. Industry trade publications featured articles about the restaurant chain's innovative use of technology, specifically mentioning the custom database system that had transformed their operations. Several competing restaurant groups contacted me about developing similar solutions for their businesses. Meanwhile, Frank's descriptions of my entrepreneurial venture continued to follow the familiar pattern of private skepticism and public embellishment. During our phone conversations, he'd express concern about my financial stability and question whether I was really making any money from this computer hobby. But according to Helen, Frank's conversations with neighbors and coworkers painted a completely different picture. He'd apparently been telling people about his daughter's successful technology consulting firm and how he'd helped her develop the business plan by sharing his years of management experience. These claims were particularly galling because Frank had never shown any interest in my actual business operations. He'd never asked to see my business plan, didn't understand what services my company provided, and had actively discouraged me from starting the venture in the first place. The contradiction became even more pronounced when Thomson Database Solutions was featured in a regional business magazine as one of 10 emerging tech companies to watch. The article included a photograph of me in my expanded office space, which I'd rented after outgrowing my apartment, and detailed quotes about my vision for the company's future growth. Frank somehow obtained multiple copies of this magazine, though he never mentioned reading the article during our conversations. Helen told me that he'd been showing it to anyone who would look, describing how proud he was of my accomplishments and how he'd always believed in my potential. When I directly asked Frank if he'd seen the magazine article, his response was typically dismissive. "Oh, those business magazines publish articles about anyone who pays for advertising space. Don't let that kind of publicity go to your head. Focus on building a sustainable business instead of chasing media attention." By the end of my second year, Thomson Database Solutions employed 4 full-time developers and maintained contracts with 37 clients across 6 states. We'd moved into professional office space in downtown San Francisco, complete with a conference room for client meetings and individual workstations for each team member. The financial success allowed me to purchase my first house, a charming Victorian in the Richmond district that required substantial renovation but offered tremendous potential. I threw myself into the restoration project, learning about electrical work and plumbing while maintaining my demanding business schedule. Frank's reaction to my home purchase was predictably critical. "Margaret, you're getting ahead of yourself. That neighborhood is way too expensive for someone in your situation. You should rent a sensible apartment until your business proves it can last more than a few years." "Dad, I can afford the mortgage payments and real estate is a good investment. The house needs work, but I'm learning how to do most of the repairs myself." "You don't know anything about home renovation. Those old houses are money pits that will eat up all your profits. You're making the same mistake a lot of young people make, spending money you don't really have on things you don't really need." Yet once again, Frank's private criticism contrasted sharply with his public boasting. Helen reported that he'd been driving by my house to take photographs, which he then showed to relatives and friends while describing the beautiful home my daughter bought with her computer business profits. Planning my parents' 25th wedding anniversary party became a labor of love that consumed 3 months of careful preparation. Helen had mentioned wanting to celebrate this milestone with extended family, but Frank seemed reluctant to spend money on what he called unnecessary festivities. I volunteered to organize and fund the entire event, seeing it as an opportunity to honor my parents' quarter-century marriage while bringing together relatives who rarely gathered outside of funerals and graduations. The guest list included 53 people: aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, and several of Frank's co-workers from the automotive plant. Selecting the perfect venue proved challenging, given Frank's aversion to anything he might perceive as pretentious or expensive. I eventually decided to host the party at my childhood home, which would accommodate all the guests while maintaining the comfortable, familiar atmosphere Frank preferred. The catering menu featured traditional American comfort foods, barbecued ribs, roasted chicken potato salad, coleslaw, and a selection of desserts including Helen's favorite lemon cake. I hired a small jazz ensemble to provide background music, choosing classic standards from the 1950s and 60s that would appeal to my parents' generation. Decorating the house required careful attention to Frank's conservative tastes, while creating an elegant celebration worthy of such an important milestone. I chose a color scheme of gold and cream, with fresh flower arrangements throughout the main rooms, and string lights creating a warm ambiance in the backyard. The week before the party, I took vacation time from my company to handle final preparations. Shopping for ingredients, confirming arrangements with vendors, and transforming our modest family home into an elegant venue required exhausting attention to detail. Frank's involvement in these preparations was minimal but problematic. He complained about the disruption to his normal routine, while simultaneously taking credit for the planning decisions I'd made. When neighbors asked about the upcoming celebration, Frank described how he'd arranged everything and was throwing a big party for Helen. His most irritating habit was interrupting my conversations with vendors to offer unnecessary commentary or contradictory instructions. When the florist arrived to discuss centerpiece options, Frank appeared at my shoulder to explain that he'd chosen flowers that would complement Helen's favorite colors. The morning of the anniversary party brought beautiful weather and my carefully orchestrated timeline of vendor arrivals. The caterers set up their equipment in our kitchen, while the musicians arranged their instruments in the living room. I spent 2 hours arranging flowers, setting up beverage stations, and ensuring every detail met my high standards. As guests began arriving around 3 o'clock, Frank positioned himself near the front door to greet everyone with elaborate descriptions of the party he'd planned to honor Helen's devotion. I watched from across the room as he accepted congratulations for the beautiful decorations and delicious menu, never once mentioning my role in organizing the celebration. My extended family hadn't gathered in over 5 years, so the first hour involved catching up on career changes, new grandchildren, and other family developments. Several relatives commented on my business success, having heard details from Helen's Christmas letters or Frank's occasional phone calls. Uncle Raymond, Frank's younger brother, approached me with genuine enthusiasm about Thomson database solutions. "Margaret, your father tells me you're running quite an operation out in California. He's very proud of how well you've done with the computer business." "Thank you, Uncle Raymond. It's been a lot of hard work, but we've built something really special." "Frank was just telling me about all the advice he's given you over the years. He said you call him regularly for guidance on business decisions." This statement was so far from reality that I initially thought Raymond had confused me with someone else. Frank and I rarely discussed my business, and when we did, his contributions consisted mainly of warnings about financial risks and predictions of eventual failure. I'd never called him for advice about anything related to Thomson database solutions. Before I could correct this misunderstanding, Aunt Carol joined our conversation with similar comments about Frank's mentorship of my entrepreneurial career. According to her version of events, Frank had been instrumental in helping Margaret develop her business plan and continued to serve as her primary advisor for strategic decisions. Throughout the afternoon, I encountered variation after variation of this same fabricated narrative. Frank had apparently spent years telling relatives and friends that he was deeply involved in my company's operations, offering regular guidance and sharing credit for our success. The most infuriating aspect was watching Frank nod along with these conversations, accepting praise for his wise counsel and business expertise, while never acknowledging that these stories were complete fiction. He'd created an alternate reality where he played a central role in my professional achievements, despite his actual record of discouragement and opposition. As the afternoon progressed and alcohol consumption increased, Frank's behavior became more boastful and less filtered. He regaled guests with increasingly elaborate stories about his contributions to my education and career development, describing himself as the architect of my success rather than the obstacle I'd overcome. The breaking point came during the official toast, which I'd expected to be a simple expression of gratitude for 25 years of marriage. Frank stood before our assembled family and friends, glass raised, ready to address the crowd that had gathered to celebrate this milestone. "Helen and I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate our anniversary," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. 25 years of marriage has taught us both a lot about life, love, and raising children." So far, his speech followed conventional lines expressing appropriate sentiments for the occasion. I relaxed slightly, hoping he'd keep his remarks brief and focused on his relationship with Helen. "We've been blessed with 3 wonderful children who've grown into successful adults." Frank continued, his gaze sweeping across the room to acknowledge my brothers and me. "Our boys have both established themselves in solid, practical careers that make their parents proud." My stomach began to tighten as I sensed the direction his speech was heading. Frank's emphasis on practical careers and his pointed distinction between my brothers and me suggested trouble ahead. "Our daughter Margaret has certainly surprised us all with her adventures in California." Frank said, his tone shifting subtly toward condescension. "She's always been the dreamer of the family, chasing after grand schemes and fancy ideas." Uncomfortable silence began spreading through the crowd as guests sensed the increasingly negative tone of Frank's supposedly celebratory remarks. Helen's face showed growing alarm as she recognized the warning signs of Frank's tendency toward cruel commentary. Now, Margaret thinks she's running some big computer company out there, but let's be honest about what that really means. Frank continued, his voice growing louder and more belligerent. She's playing around with expensive toys and calling it business. Real success comes from real work, not these high-tech fantasies. The room fell completely silent except for the soft jazz music still playing in the background. 53 guests watched in horrified fascination as Frank used this celebratory moment to publicly humiliate his own daughter. "Margaret, I love you, but it's time someone told you the truth," Frank said, turning to look directly at me with glazed eyes and a cruel smile. "You'll never amount to anything substantial. All this computer nonsense is just a phase you'll grow out of eventually." The words hung in the air like poison gas, creating a bubble of stunned silence around our family gathering. 53 people, including grandparents, cousins, family friends, and Frank's coworkers, stared at me with expressions ranging from sympathy to shock to mortification. My immediate impulse was to flee the room to escape this public humiliation and process my father's cruelty in private. For 32 years, I'd endured his dismissive comments and lack of support. But this represented something far worse, a deliberate attempt to destroy my reputation in front of our entire extended family. But as I stood there feeling the weight of every gaze in the room, something fundamental shifted inside me. I thought about the 8-year-old girl who'd built her first computer while Frank called it worthless junk. I remembered the high school student who'd won state science fair recognition while he worked overtime instead of attending. I recalled the college graduate who'd succeeded at MIT despite his opposition and the entrepreneur who'd built a thriving business while he predicted failure. For 24 years, I'd absorbed Frank's criticism and negativity, always hoping that my next achievement would finally earn his respect and approval. But standing in that moment, surrounded by relatives who'd been fed years of lies about his role in my success, I realized that Frank's approval was never coming. Worse, he'd been actively stealing credit for my work while simultaneously undermining my confidence. The decision to speak up felt like stepping off a cliff, but I knew I couldn't remain silent anymore. My voice, when it finally emerged, was steady and clear, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Dad, since you're so concerned about honesty, let's be completely honest with everyone here today." Frank's smug expression began to falter as he realized I wasn't going to retreat quietly from his attack. The guests remained frozen in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether they were witnessing a family intervention or a complete breakdown. "You just told 50 people that I'll never amount to anything, but that's interesting coming from someone who spent years taking credit for my work and claiming responsibility for my success." "Margaret, don't make a scene," Frank said, his voice lacking its previous confidence. "This isn't the time or place for one of your emotional outbursts." "You're absolutely right that this isn't the appropriate time or place," I replied, my anger building momentum. "But you made it the time and place when you decided to humiliate me during your anniversary toast." I turned to address the crowd directly, knowing that this might be my only opportunity to set the record straight after years of Frank's fabricated stories. "Most of you have heard Dad talk about how involved he's been in my business success, how he's guided my career decisions and helped develop my company. I want to share the real story about Frank's role in my professional life." Frank's face had gone pale, and he was making small gestures with his hands, trying to signal me to stop talking. But I'd spent too many years accommodating his need to control every narrative about our family. When I was 8 years old, I built my first working computer from discarded electronics. Dad called it worthless junk and told me to focus on cooking and cleaning instead. When I won first place at the state science fair in high school, Dad was working overtime and missed the entire ceremony because he said academic competitions weren't important. Several relatives were nodding their expressions, suggesting they remembered these events differently from Frank's revised versions. When I got accepted to MIT with partial scholarship, Dad told me I was making a huge mistake and that women don't belong in engineering programs. He refused to provide any financial support, so I worked multiple jobs throughout college to pay for my education. Helen's face showed a mixture of pride and sadness, as she watched me finally articulate experiences she'd witnessed but never acknowledged publicly. During my junior year at MIT, I developed a revolutionary inventory management algorithm that could reduce warehouse waste by 30%. When I shared this achievement with Dad, he told me to stop dreaming about grandiose discoveries and focus on getting a practical job. Frank was now actively trying to interrupt me, but I continued speaking over his protests. 6 months later, I discovered that Dad had stolen my algorithm and given it to his friend Bill, who implemented it in his manufacturing company. When I confronted Dad about this theft of my intellectual property, he claimed he'd improved my academic theory into something actually useful. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests began to understand the magnitude of Frank's betrayal. Uncle Raymond looked particularly shocked since he clearly remembered Frank taking credit for mentoring my business development. When I graduated summa cum laude from MIT and got my first job in San Francisco, Dad told people he'd always encouraged my interest in technology and that he'd made sure I got a good technical education. This is the same man who'd actively opposed every step of my educational journey. Frank was now trying to speak, but his words came out as incoherent stammering. The confident, boastful man who delivered the cruel toast had been replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. When I started Thomson Database Solutions, Dad predicted I'd fail within a year and told me to stick with employment instead of chasing business ownership fantasies. But when my company was featured in business magazines, Dad bought multiple copies to show his friends while claiming he'd helped develop my business plan. I paused to let these revelations sink in before delivering the final blow. Dad has spent years telling all of you that he's been my business mentor and advisor, that I call him regularly for guidance on strategic decisions. The truth is, we rarely discuss my business at all, and when we do, his contributions consist entirely of warnings about financial risks and predictions of failure. The silence that followed was even more profound than the one that had greeted Frank's initial attack. But this time, the quiet felt different, charged with recognition and understanding rather than shock and discomfort. So when Dad says, "I'll never amount to anything you should know," that this is the same man who's been systematically stealing credit for my achievements while working to undermine my confidence for over 20 years. Frank finally found his voice, though it emerged as a weak croak. "Margaret, you're exaggerating everything. I've always been proud of you. Maybe I expressed my concerns differently than you remember, but I've always wanted what's best for you." "Then stop taking credit for my work," I said, my voice ringing with absolute conviction. "If you truly believe I'll never amount to anything, then stop telling people you're responsible for everything I've accomplished." The sound of Frank's jaw actually dropping was audible in the stunned silence that followed. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any words, giving him the appearance of a fish gasping for air. The immediate aftermath of my confrontation created a scene unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Frank stood frozen beside the makeshift podium, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and something that might have been shame. The 53 guests remained completely silent, processing the dramatic revelation of 20 years' worth of deception and manipulation. Uncle Raymond was the first person to break the spell, walking directly over to me with purpose and determination. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. Your father has been telling us stories about mentoring your career that apparently weren't true. I had no idea he'd been taking credit for your accomplishments." His words seemed to release the rest of the crowd from their frozen state. Several relatives approached me with similar expressions of support and bewilderment, clearly struggling to reconcile Frank's fabricated narratives with the reality I'd just revealed. Aunt Carol, who'd earlier praised Frank's business guidance, looked particularly disturbed. "Margaret, honey, I'm so sorry. We had no idea Frank was making up those stories about helping with your company. What you've accomplished on your own is even more impressive than we realized." My cousin Jennifer, who worked as a nurse in Detroit, squeezed my hand while speaking in a low voice. "I always wondered why Uncle Frank's stories about supporting your education didn't match what Aunt Helen told us privately. Now it all makes sense." Helen herself remained seated at the head table, her face showing a complex mixture of emotions. She'd witnessed Frank's behavior firsthand for 25 years, but this was the first time anyone had confronted him publicly about his pattern of credit theft and manipulation. Frank, meanwhile, had managed to compose himself enough to attempt damage control. His strategy involved alternating between defensive justifications and attempts to minimize the significance of what had just occurred. "Margaret is getting emotional and making this sound worse than it really was," he announced to anyone within earshot. "Every parent gives advice and guidance to their children. Maybe I didn't express myself perfectly every time, but my intentions were always good." Several guests looked skeptical of this explanation, particularly those who'd heard Frank's detailed claims about his ongoing involvement in my business operations. His attempt to reframe systematic deception as imperfect parenting wasn't convincing anyone who'd paid attention to my specific examples. My brother David approached me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine respect mixed with apology. "Margaret, I had no idea Dad was doing that to you. Mom told us bits and pieces over the years, but we never understood how bad it really was." "I should have spoken up sooner," I replied. But I kept hoping he'd eventually acknowledge my achievements honestly instead of stealing credit for them. My younger brother Michael joined our conversation, his face showing similar remorse. "We knew Dad was hard on you growing up, but we thought that was just his way of pushing you to succeed. We didn't realize he was actively working against you while taking credit for your accomplishments." Their support meant more than I'd expected, since my brothers had always seemed to accept Frank's version of family dynamics without question. Learning that they'd noticed his unfair treatment, even if they hadn't fully understood its scope, helped validate my decision to finally speak up. The party's atmosphere had fundamentally changed from celebration to something resembling a family intervention. Small groups of relatives clustered together, discussing what they'd just witnessed and comparing notes about Frank's various claims over the years. Frank's co-workers from the automotive plant seemed particularly uncomfortable, since they'd been hearing his boastful stories about his daughter's success for years. Now they understood that his proud father routine was based on stolen credit, rather than actual involvement in my achievements. Helen finally stood up from her chair and walked over to where I was standing with my brothers. Her approach created a moment of tense anticipation, since everyone was curious about how she'd respond to my public confrontation with Frank. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet room, "I'm proud of you for finally standing up for yourself. You've accomplished incredible things despite your father's lack of support, and it's time everyone knew the truth about that." Her words created another wave of stunned silence, since Helen rarely contradicted Frank publicly or acknowledged problems in their marriage. This simple statement represented perhaps the most direct criticism of her husband she'd ever offered in front of other people. Frank's reaction to Helen's comment was immediate and defensive. "Helen, you're taking Margaret's side without understanding the full situation. I've always tried to prepare our children for real-world challenges. Maybe my methods weren't perfect, but my goals were always supportive." "Frank," Helen replied, her voice steady but firm, "I've watched you dismiss Margaret's achievements for 20 years while taking credit for her success when talking to other people. That's not supportive parenting. That's manipulation." The directness of Helen's criticism clearly shocked Frank more than my own confrontation had. He'd apparently never expected his wife to publicly acknowledge his behavior or challenge his version of events. Several more relatives approached me throughout the next hour, offering support and sharing their own observations about Frank's contradictory stories over the years. Many had noticed inconsistencies in his accounts, but had assumed they'd misunderstood details rather than questioning his honesty. As the afternoon wound down, Frank made several attempts to restart normal party conversations, but the celebratory mood had been permanently altered. Most guests left earlier than originally planned, offering warm congratulations to Helen and brief awkward farewells to Frank. The cleanup process provided an opportunity for extended family members to continue processing what they'd witnessed. My aunts and uncles helped carry dishes and decorations, while discussing how Frank's behavior explained various puzzling conversations they'd had with him over the years. By evening, only immediate family remained in the house that had witnessed such a dramatic confrontation. Frank retreated to his bedroom claiming exhaustion, while Helen, my brothers, and I finished cleaning up the remnants of what should have been a joyful celebration. The ride back to my hotel that night felt surreal, as if I'd just survived a natural disaster or witnessed a life-changing accident. For the first time in my adult life, I'd refused to accept Frank's dismissive treatment and demanded acknowledgement of his deceptive behavior. 3 days later, back in San Francisco, Frank called me at my office. His voice sounded different than I'd ever heard it, smaller, less confident, almost vulnerable. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what happened at the party, and I want to apologize for some of the things I said." The word "some" caught my attention immediately, suggesting that Frank still wasn't prepared to acknowledge the full scope of his problematic behavior. "I may have been harder on you over the years than I should have been," he continued. "I was raised to believe that criticism helps children develop resilience, but maybe I went too far sometimes." This partial apology felt frustrating because it still framed his systematic credit theft and manipulation as overly strict parenting rather than deliberate deception. Frank seemed incapable of admitting that he'd actively worked to undermine my confidence while stealing recognition for my achievements. "Dad, the problem isn't that you were hard on me. The problem is that you spent years telling people you were responsible for my success while privately predicting my failure. That's not tough love. That's manipulation. Margaret, I may have exaggerated my role in your career when talking to other people, but that came from pride, not malicious intent. Sometimes parents want to feel more involved in their children's accomplishments than they actually were." Even his apology contained another lie, since exaggerating his role dramatically understated the scope of his fabricated stories about mentoring my business development and providing ongoing strategic guidance. Our conversation ended without resolution, as Frank remained unable or unwilling to acknowledge the full truth about his behavior. But something fundamental had shifted in our relationship dynamic. I no longer felt obligated to seek his approval or accept his dismissive treatment of my achievements. 6 months later, Thomson Database Solutions signed our largest contract ever, a multi-year agreement with a national retail chain to develop inventory management systems for over 200 stores. The project represented everything I dreamed of when starting my company, validating years of hard work and innovative thinking. When I called home to share this milestone, Frank's response was notably different from his previous pattern. Instead of minimizing my achievement or predicting future problems, he offered simple congratulations and asked thoughtful questions about the project's scope. More importantly, when Helen later told me about Frank's conversations with neighbors and coworkers, his descriptions were accurate rather than embellished. He'd apparently stopped claiming credit for my business decisions and started acknowledging that my success resulted from my own efforts and abilities. The change wasn't dramatic or complete, but it represented significant progress from someone who'd spent decades unable to honestly discuss my accomplishments. Standing up to Frank at the anniversary party hadn't magically transformed our relationship, but it had established boundaries that prevented him from continuing his pattern of manipulation and credit theft. My professional life continued flourishing as Thomson Database Solutions expanded into new markets and hired additional staff members. The company's reputation for innovative solutions and exceptional customer service generated referrals faster than we could handle them, requiring careful planning to manage our growth sustainably. More personally, the experience of finally confronting Frank taught me valuable lessons about self-advocacy and the importance of setting clear boundaries with people who try to diminish your achievements. I realized that seeking approval from someone who systematically undermined your confidence is not only futile, but actively harmful to your own growth and happiness. The anniversary party confrontation became a turning point that freed me from decades of seeking validation from someone who was fundamentally unable or unwilling to provide it. Instead of continuing to hope that my next achievement would finally earn Frank's respect, I learned to find satisfaction and motivation from my own sense of accomplishment and from the genuine support of people who truly valued my work. Looking back now, I understand that Frank's behavior stemmed from his own insecurities and need to feel important rather than from any actual assessment of my abilities. His attempts to steal credit for my achievements revealed more about his own feelings of inadequacy than about my potential for success. The most profound lesson from this experience was learning that you can't control how other people respond to your accomplishments, but you can control whether you allow their negativity to define your self-worth. Sometimes the people who should support you most are the ones who hold you back most effectively, and breaking free from their influence is essential for your own emotional and professional development. Standing up to Frank required tremendous courage, but it also demonstrated that confronting destructive behavior is often the only way to stop it from continuing. Years of hoping he'd change on his own had accomplished nothing, but one moment of direct confrontation had immediately altered our family's entire dynamic. Today, Thomson Database Solutions employs 22 people and maintains contracts with clients across 15 states. We've expanded into cloud computing services and artificial intelligence applications, staying at the forefront of technological innovation while maintaining our commitment to personalized customer service. My relationship with Frank has evolved into something more honest and respectful, though it required establishing clear boundaries about what behavior I'm willing to accept. He no longer claims credit for my work or makes predictions about my inevitable failure, and our conversations focus on topics where we can interact positively. The most rewarding aspect of this journey has been discovering that my own approval and sense of accomplishment are far more valuable than recognition from someone who's incapable of offering genuine support. Learning to validate my own achievements liberated me from the exhausting cycle of seeking approval from people who were determined to withhold it. If you've experienced similar dynamics in your own family or professional relationships, I want you to know that speaking up for yourself is worth the temporary discomfort it might cause. The people who truly care about your well-being will respect your boundaries, while those who don't respect your boundaries probably don't deserve access to your energy and emotional investment. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to demand the respect you've always deserved, even if that means confronting people who've spent years trying to convince you that you're not worthy of it. Your achievements belong to you, and no one has the right to steal credit for your hard work or undermine your confidence in your own abilities. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who was taking credit for your work or undermining your achievements? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences about overcoming family challenges and finding your own voice. Share this video with anyone who might need the encouragement to speak up for themselves. Remember, you deserve recognition for your own accomplishments, and you have the right to demand honesty from the people in your life. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the courage to claim credit for your own amazing achievements. Until next time, keep believing in yourself and never let anyone convince you that you're not capable of incredible things.